Welcome to the webinar series of Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. Today we have the pleasure of having with us Professor Ajay Mehra, who is Atal Bihari Vajpayee Senior Fellow at Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. He is a distinguished scholar who has occupied many important positions in his long career. He retired as the principal of Shahid Bhagat Singh College in 2018, and ever since 2019, he has been a senior fellow here at Nehru Memorial. I warmly welcome Professor Mehra, and I thank him for kindly agreeing to deliver this talk online. And I welcome all members of the audience as well. The subject that we have today, on which Professor Mehra will speak, is Prime Minister in the Indian Parliamentary System. We know that the subject is very, very topical. This is a subject on which the debate has been raging on ever since the Constitution came into existence. And as I understand, Professor Mehra is today going to focus on the debates within the Constituent Assembly on the question of Prime Minister. One aspect of the debate was about whether India should have a parliamentary system or a presidential system. Now, surprisingly, notwithstanding the fact that India had borrowed its model, or India was trying to borrow its model from England, and it was based on what is described as Westminster model, the fact is that there were some voices in the Constitution which would have preferred the presidential system, especially the one based on the United States of America, which was regarded as the most flourishing and the oldest democracy in the world. However, the fact is that a vast majority of the members of the Constituent Assembly were in favor of a parliamentary system based on Westminster model, and that was the system that ultimately came to be enshrined by the framers of the Constitution. The second aspect of the debate, which was, I think, more important and more concrete, was what should be the role of the Prime Minister in the government, what should be the relationship between the Prime Minister and his cabinet, what should be the relationship between Prime Minister and President, the relationship between Prime Minister and Parliament, and so on and so forth. All these were important questions which were discussed at length in the meetings of the Constituent Assembly, and ultimately a policy was laid down in the Constitution. However, the fact is that every constitution ultimately evolves in terms of its practice over a period of time, and that is what has happened to our Constitution as well. So I hope that Professor Mehra will also throw some light on the practical aspect of it, the implementation of the Constitution, though I understand that his focus is probably on the debates within the Constituent Assembly on the natures and powers of the Prime Minister and his role in India's parliamentary system. With these very few words, I would now like to once again warmly welcome Professor Mehra and invite him to deliver his lecture.
Thank you, Chair. I hope I'm audible. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. This is what I'm going to speak today is part of the study that I am engaged in at the moment. Prime Minister indeed has been a very, very key role of the entire constitutional structure that we have, given the fact that we borrowed and adapted the Westminster model for India. Prime Minister is important from various aspects. A, of course, he is the chief executive of the country. B, he also leads the party, he leads the parliament, he leads the nation. So given all these facts, Prime Minister is very, very important. From that perspective, it is very significant to look at how the framers of the Constitution looked at framing the prime ministerial institution for the country and how it evolved. Broadly speaking, I have kept, my presentation today in two parts. In the first part, I'll be talking about what I call framing the framework, how the framework of the parliamentary system and the Prime Minister in this Westminster model was perceived, what were the key arguments advanced in the Constituent Assembly, and the second, the emergence of PM in the Indian polity. Given the constraint of time, I'll be speaking roughly for about 40-45 minutes. I will be constrained to skip some of the portions. Since there are constitutional provisions as well as long statements of various members of the Constituent Assembly involved, I will be reading from the text that I have prepared. In order to constitutionally and according to it politically situate the Prime Minister, it would be worthwhile to understand the framing of the apex executive consisting of the President of India and of the Prime Minister by the Constituent Assembly. This would mean looking at how draft articles 41, 42 and 43 shaped into articles 52, 53 and 54 of the Constitution, creating the office of the President of India at the head of the executive. President-Prime Minister relationship is very important. That's why I am focusing on these articles. Similarly, the discussion to shape draft articles 61, 62, 64 and 65, which eventually shaped into articles 74, 75, 77 and 78, that created the Council of Ministers to aid and advise the President with the Prime Minister at the head, as well as laid out the manner of conduct of business of the Government of India. The duties of the Prime Minister to furnish information to the President would deserve a critical look. The discussion on draft Article 41 took place on 10 December 1948. And main contention represented by Professor K.T. Shah and H.V. Kamath was that in the place of the 7-word draft that was presented there, by the drafting committee, there shall be a President of India, quote unquote, which does not bring out the sovereignty of the people lie in the President. So K.T. Shah proposed that it should be, and I quote, the Chief Executive and Head of the State of the Union of India shall be called the President of India, unquote, be replaced. This would settle the situating of popular sovereignty in the office of the President of India. After an animated discussion, the motion was negatived. Similarly, the discussion on the draft Article 42, which became Article 53 eventually, on which also K.T. Shah suggested a detailed amendment focused on the sovereignty of the country represented by the President of India. Time and again, there were comparisons with the British monarch's status as the head of the state. Shah said, and I quote, I would therefore suggest that the powers and functions of the President should have the place as if they are powers and functions of the sovereign people being exercised by the Chief Executive of the state. Shah stressed the President's right to consult not only any minister or officer of the government, but also to seek advice, if needed, from an informed expert on the subject. I quote, under the parliamentary party system, it will be his veto. He would have no right to discard an advice of his minister. The minister's will would eventually prevail, but it will prevail only after the President has drawn attention, according to my conception, to the other aspects of the matter which the minister has overlooked or ignored, unquote. He insisted, I'm talking of Professor K.T. Shah, he insisted that the President must have, like the British King, the right to warn, to advise, and eventually to surrender. He would advise as a matter of right from an informed expert opinion to elucidate any point coming before him and then telling his minister concerned or the ministry as a whole that this is the proper view. If you do not think it is proper, very well then, you are finally a responsible party and you can do as you think proper. For draft Article 42, which became Article 53, also he moved an elaborate amendment detailing the powers of the President. He sought amendment of the clause 2 of the article, which, as in the final article, made the President the Supreme Commander of the Defence Forces. Shah detailed each and every possible presidential power. K.T. Shah made a significant point through the two amendments he moved on draft Article 41 and 42, which became Articles 52 and 53 eventually, regarding the form and exercise of the executive power of the proposed Indian Republic in the Westminster mode. The format proposed has significance for the President-Prime Minister power equation and relationship, as well as on constitutionally situating the office of the Prime Minister in the Indian political system. He was obviously in favor of adding substance to presidential power without upsetting the balance of the parliamentary system in which the Prime Minister heads the Council of Ministers and the government. In fact, some of the issues he raised did crop up in the way the first President, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, and first PM, Jawaharlal Nehru, looked at the relationship. However, K. Munshi, in his response to Shah, asserted the basic tenets of the Westminster model and why India should adhere to it. He said, and I quote, I'm quoting K. Munshi, Kanhaiya Lalwani Lal Munshi, "We must not forget a very important fact that during the last 100 years, the Indian public life has largely drawn upon the traditions of the British constitutional law. Most of us, and during the last several generations before us, public men in India have looked up to the British model as the best." As a matter of fact, today, the Dominion of Government of India is functioning as a full-fledged parliamentary government. After the experience, why should we go back upon the tradition that has built for over 100 years and try a new experiment, which was, as I said, framed 150 years ago, which has been found wanting even in America. Clearly, he was trying to emphasize the fact that we have been operating Westminster model, and the Westminster model is the best suited for Indian conditions. Allahabadi Krishna Swami Iyer expressed similar sentiments, emphasizing the significance of the cabinet government for India. He emphasized that so far as the provinces in India are concerned, we have been accustomed to something like the cabinet form of government for some years. We have got into that framework. Anticipating a conflict between the legislature and the executive in the presidential system, Iyer said, and I quote, an infant democracy cannot afford under modern conditions to take the risk of a perpetual cleavage, feud or conflict or threatened conflict between the legislation and executive. The object of the present constitutional structure is to prevent a conflict between the legislature and the executive and to promote harmony between the different parts of the governmental system. The discussion on situating the head of the state, the president in Indian constitutional scheme on the Westminster model, raised a question regarding making the office more consequential vis-a-vis the PM, though giving the PM salience due in a parliamentary system. Some members, such as K.T. Shah, were not content with a replica of the British sovereign. Indeed, Shah's proposal was rejected following too powerful defense of the parliamentary system being proposed on the basis of experience and tradition. But later developments, such as the differences between President Dr. Rajendra Prasad and PM Mehra, between President Gyani Zail Singh and PM Rajiv Gandhi, and President Dr. K.R. Narayanan and PM Atal Bihari Vajpayee, proved the drafting committee of the Constituent Assembly right. In the evolving President-PM relationship in India's constitutional democracy, though presidential discretion emerged as a significant factor in critical times, the PM emerged as a leader who guides the nation, whether in majority or in coalition. The debate in the Constituent Assembly on the draft Articles 61, 62, 64 and 65, which eventually became Article 74, 75, 77, 78. These are the governing articles that define Council of Ministers, situate the Prime Minister in the constitutional system, and also hint at the relationship between the President of India, the sovereign, and the Prime Minister, are equally significant to comprehend the conceptualization of the office of the PM. At the very outset, Mahbub Ali Beg Sahab Bahadur proposed an amendment to the proposed Article 61 that mentioned Council of Ministers but not the PM, and added subclause B that restricted the Council to 15 members who would be elected by elected members of both the Houses of Parliament from among themselves in accordance with the system of proportional representation by means of single transferable vote, and one of the members shall be elected as Prime Minister in like manner. In proposing this, parliamentary democracy as not being democracy at all. For the prevailing system, the party with 50% plus one members forms the government, with the leader invited to be the PM, and then he chooses the rest of the council. He proposed his proposal was meant to do away with the with what he considered to be shortcoming in the parliamentary system. Second significant amendment proposal and intervention on draft Article 61 was Professor K.T. Shah. K.T. Shah was a very active member of the Constituent Assembly. He, in discussion of each and every clause, he came up with amendments and suggestions. Shah proposed that the PM should not be mentioned in clause 1 because he would be like any other minister whose portfolio is not mentioned in the Constitution. Only after a minister is appointed, her or his portfolio is allotted. Like a minister could be removed if she or he does not perform well, the PM should also be removed. He also objected to the PM's privilege to recommend resolution of Parliament in case she or he loses majority. The point being as to why an unwelcome PM should have the right to recommend resolution of Parliament. He was for enforcing greater responsibility, hence he proposed that following every change in the Council of Ministers, the PM or the President should seek a vote of confidence for the members of the Council, and those who do not win the vote should resign. He was for only those elected or either elected to either House of Parliament to be appointed a minister, if not, should seek election within 6 months. Strong reactions followed Shah's proposal, as several members felt that the proposed amendments compromise position of the government. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar very thoughtfully and very strongly reacted to the suggestions made by Professor K.T. Shah. He dealt in detail with 4 proposed amendments of Professor K.T. Shah. The Prime Minister not recognized by statute, every minister on appointment seeking a vote of confidence in Parliament, a minister not elected on appointment to seek election in 6 months, and no person convicted of bribery and corruption be appointed a minister. He pointed out that the British Prime Minister, who was recognized only by convention, got a statutory status in 1939 in the Act of the Salaries of the Ministers of Cabinet. And I quote Dr. Ambedkar, if Professor K.T. Shah has no objection for convention to create a Prime Minister, I should have thought there was hardly any objection to giving a statutory recognition to the position of the Prime Minister, unquote. He further said, and I again quote, I want to tell my friend Professor K.T. Shah that his amendment would be absolutely fatal to the other principle which we want to enact, namely collective responsibility. The only sanction through which collective responsibility can be enforced is through the Prime Minister. In my judgment, collective responsibility is enforced by the enforcement of two principles. One principle is that no person shall be nominated to the cabinet except on the advice of the Prime Minister. Secondly, no person shall be retained as a member of the cabinet if the Prime Minister says that he shall be dismissed. On the prospect of no Prime Minister, he added, and I quote, supposing you have no Prime Minister, what would happen is this, that every minister will be subject to the control or influence of the President. It will be perfectly possible for the President, who is not ad idem with a particular cabinet, to deal with each minister separately, singly, influence them, and thereby cause disruption in the cabinet. Unquote. Ambedkar dismissed Shah's second point as not required. He agreed with his third point, which he said was provided for in Article 62, Clause 5, making the amendment unnecessary. His fourth point, he pointed out, was well taken, but there was no necessity of putting it in the statute. He said, and I quote, "It is not called desirable, nor is it not sufficient that we should trust the Prime Minister, the legislature, and the public at large, watching the action of the minister and the action of the legislature to see that no such infamous thing is done by either of them." Article 75 of the Constitution, which was draft Article 62, had three important provisions relating to the Prime Minister. First, Clause 1 of the article says, and I quote, "The Prime Minister shall be appointed by the President, and the other minister shall be appointed by the President on the advice of the Prime Minister." Second, Clause 2 says, "The ministers shall hold office during the pleasure of the President." Third, Clause 3 says, "The Council of Ministers shall be collectively responsible to the House of the People." Clearly, both the constitutional duty of appointing the Prime Minister and of extending the pleasure by the President of India to the Prime Minister and other members of the Council of Ministers to continue in office are restricted by collective responsibility, which is a very important, to the Westminster model of the Council of Ministers to the House of the People. However, this aspect of the prime ministerial position did not invite any amendment, and consequently, it was not discussed during the debate on the draft Article 62. The debates in the Constituent Assembly on the office of the President of India and the Prime Minister clearly draw substantially, if not entirely, from the Westminster model, replacing conventions with the statute, yet leaving room for interpretation in the light of convention of the British Constitution in case ambiguities arise. If the President of India is in similar mold as the British monarch, the Prime Minister is also in the framework of the British Cabinet, primus inter pares, holding the Council of Ministers together with collective responsibility and political homogeneity. Indeed, a lot in the British system function on conventions, even though they do not apply to the Indian case. Conventions of the British Constitution were mentioned and referred to as the principles that could guide the shaping of the office of the head of state and his relationship with the head of the government and vice versa. Despite some members wanting the President to be given more powers, at least some discretion, though keeping her and his role restricted to advice, the Assembly was overwhelmingly in favor of a President in the mold of a British monarch. Of course, the Assembly could not have guessed the complete political situation that arose in later years, giving the President the opportunity to make difficult choices. Seemingly, the design of the presidential office, without formally assigning discretionary power, vested it with different discretion to deal with political situation, demanding difficult choices and balancing acts. There was absolute clarity on the position of the PM as the leader of the country, despite some members having different views regarding a more nuanced position of the PM. For example, K.T. Shah not wanting a mention of the post in the Constitution, making the PM, like any other minister, whose portfolio is not mentioned. K. Santhanam and Ambedkar made the status clear that the PM would enjoy the powers due to a PM in the Westminster model. They argued the stressing familiarity with the system that had been functioning in provinces. For this reason, the proposal suggesting elections of the members of the Council of Ministers by the House of the People was negated by the Assembly. It was said that such a situation would come in the way of collective responsibility, a concept that clearly situates the PM as the leader of the government and the House of the People. Even though the PM is duty bound to keep the President informed following the letter and spirit of Article 78, but that does not empower the President, nor such an idea advanced during the debate to either summon the PM or tamper with the appointment he makes. In fact, even the President was constitutionally enjoined to appoint the PM, keeping in view the statutory requirement of collective responsibility to the House of the People, which has been followed in cases in which the party would not have a clear majority. I close the discussion on the Constituent Assembly here, and I move now to the emergence of the Prime Minister in Indian polity. Basically, in this section, I will be talking about how the Prime Minister's office evolved through the role of Nehru and others while the function of the interim government was on. In India, the transition of the colonial government to the Westminster model parliamentary system was seamless and smooth. As analyzed in the foregoing discussion, the argument of continuity and experience advanced by K.M. Munshi and regarding stability and accountability were upheld overwhelmingly by the Constituent Assembly. The development of the system, first under the Provisional Constitution and Parliament from 15th August 1947 to 25th January 1950, and then under the new Republican Constitution since 26 January 1950, has had stresses, strains, and debates on what the office of the Prime Minister is and how it should function. Yet, the Indian democracy and the Indian variant of the Westminster model have shown resilience, durability, and robustness. The development deserves contextualization for the study of the Prime Ministerial office through 14 Prime Ministers. It needs to be noted that the discussion in the Constituent Assembly on the form of government to be adopted has stressed experience with the Westminster model parliamentary form of government to clinch the argument in its favor. The reference was to the experience of running the parliamentary form of government by the Indian leaders and the Indian National Congress under the Government of India Act 1935. There is not enough critical literature on the functioning of the provincial governments during 1937-39 to review the leadership question, if the leadership question arose in provinces, and if yes, in what fashion they were tackled within the provincial assemblies and the Congress High Command. However, the existing literature, howsoever minuscule it is, refers to party competition and the dynamics between provincial premier and governors. The second phase of the evolution of the office of Indian Prime Minister begins with the formation of interim government on 2nd September 1946. Following intense negotiations on the proposal of the Cabinet Mission Plan between the Viceroy on the one hand and the Indian National Congress and the All India Muslim League on the other. It was not a cabinet government in the true sense, even though, given the experience of the Government of India Act 1935, it was likely to resemble that. Same was true of the two subsequent versions of the interim government, one after the Muslim League joined on 25th October 1946, and the second after it left on 18 July 1947, following the announcement of partition of India, formed prior to independence. These were Viceroy's Executive Council, and the Viceroy is with the Viceroy as the President, Jawaharlal Nehru as the Vice President, and the rest as members of the Council. Political leadership at each level has political competition built into it, which is pretty intense at the apex. Not surprisingly, it became visible in India at the very outset of the emergence of the post-independence Indian polity. Political competition for the leadership of the Congress party and in the government to be began as soon as transfer of power became imminent and the processes to effect it began. Rajmohan Gandhi, a biographer of Sardar Patel, succinctly captures the political drama, and I quote him in some detail here. Since it was obvious that Azad's successor in Congress chair would be India's first de facto premier, the succession had agitated more than one heart. Azad wanted to be re-elected. Awareness of this fact agonized Azad's close friend and colleague Jawahar Lal, who had his expectations, and Vallabhbhai, who was involved. For apart from any political hopes he may have harbored, several PCCs had nominated him. Kriplani too had been proposed. So it was already multi-cornered. The political scenario that accidentally emerged in 1946 prior to the formation of the interim government was a multi-corner leadership contest out of which the prime ministerial candidate would emerge. Before the date for nomination closed on April 29, Mahatma Gandhi privately indicated by April 20 his preference for Nehru. The moment he read it in the press that Azad was seeking and looking forward to re-election as the Congress president, the Mahatma wrote to him, and I quote, "Please go through the enclosed cutting. I have not spoken to anyone of my opinion. When one or two working committee members asked me, I said that it would not be right for the same president to continue. If you are of the same opinion, it may be proper for you to issue a statement about the cutting and say that have no intention to become president again. In today's circumstances, I would, if asked, prefer Jawaharlal. I have many reasons for this. Why go into them?" Unquote. In the meantime, 13 out of 15 Pradesh Congress committees voted for Patel and 3 did not show any preference. The reason was that the party saw Patel a great executive, organizer and leader with his feet on the ground. His admirers saw him in the Iron Man with feet firmly planted on earth. They thought he would be able to deal better with Jinnah even at this late stage, and show the integrity and stability of the subcontinent. Critical hours lay ahead, and the Sardar's realism, they argued, would provide a safe shield. The Sardar's role in the Quit India movement also tilted the scale in favor of the PCCs. Mahatma asked Acharya Kriplani to get support for Nehru from the CWC members, despite April 29 deadline having been missed. Prompted thus, some of the members voted for Nehru. Kriplani said the following about the matter to writer Durga Das. All the PCCs sent in the name of Patel by a majority, and 1 or 2 proposed the name of Rajan Babu in addition, but none that of Jawaharlal. I knew Gandhi wanted Jawaharlal to be president of the Congress for a year, and I made a proposal myself saying some Delhi fellows want Jawaharlal's name. I circulated to the member of the working committee to get this endorsement. I played this mischief. I am to blame. Patel never forgave me for that. Kriplani indeed circulated a paper during the CWC meeting proposing Nehru's name, which was signed by the members as also by some local members. This suggests that Vallabhbhai also signed Nehru's nomination. Soon after, Kriplani withdrew his nomination and passed on a paper to Patel on which his withdrawal was written. Patel showed the sheet of paper to Gandhi, who told Nehru, and I quote, "No PCC has put forward your name, only the working committee has." Unquote. Nehru remained silent. Realizing that he would not agree to a second place in the government, Gandhi requested Patel to sign the Kriplani's draft, and Sardar complied. Durga Das, in his memoir From Cousin to Nehru and After, quotes his conversation with Mahatma. Asked about overriding the CWC, Gandhi agreed that Patel would have proved a better negotiator and organizer as Congress president, but still felt that Nehru should head the government. Asked on inconsistency in this statement, he laughed and said, and I quote, Jawaharlal is the only Englishman in my camp. He further said, Jawahar will not take second place. He is better known abroad than Sardar and make India play a role in international affairs. Sardar will look after the country's affairs. They will be like two oxen yoked to the government cart. One will need the other and both will pull together. Unquote. A year later, Gandhi virtually repeated the reason for favoring Nehru over Patel. And I quote, Jawaharlal cannot be replaced today. Within the whilst the charge is being taken from Englishmen, he, a Harrow boy, a Cambridge graduate, and a barrister, is wanted to carry on the negotiations with Englishmen. Unquote. Nehru's rapport with section of Muslims, which Patel lacked, was even disinclined to seek it, was another reason advanced by Gandhi. Yet he was sure that the two would work together. Thus was resolved the first political competition for Prime Ministership with Gandhi's intervention. Nehru took over as the President of the Indian National Congress in 1946. He was invited by the Viceroy as the party chief to form the interim government. On 2nd September 1946, the first interim government was formed by the Congress. J.B. Kripalani took over as the President of the Congress from Nehru. Nehru was appointed the Vice President of the Viceroy's Executive Council. On 25th October 1946, the Muslim League joined the government and the Executive Council was reconstituted. The Congress had 6 members, the Muslim League had 5, and 3 members represented minority communities. The government functioned till 18 July 1947. Once partition became imminent, the Muslim League members resigned from the government on 18 July 1947. The third version of the interim government functioned till 14th August 1947. Nehru got into the institution building work from the very outset. He reacted to C. Rajagopalachari, writing directly to the Viceroy regarding his inability to join the government due to in this position. And I quote, as this government is being formed on a cabinet basis, and the Viceroy has asked me as Congress President to undertake this business of forming government, it is desirable that we should act as a group and not individually. This is to say that dealing with the Viceroy should be through me and not directly. Unquote. In prime ministerial mode, he reiterated his position to the Viceroy on 1st September 1946 in the letter accompanying the list of members of the council and their portfolios. There is a very longest quotation. I will not go into that. I will read the last sentence of that particular letter, which is very important and which I have italicized in this study. It says, this government will function as a cabinet and will jointly responsible for its decisions. So even though Viceroy's Executive Council was not a cabinet, Nehru insisted that it is going to function as such. Obviously, in the donning the mantle of the Prime Minister in heading a government which was not constituted as a cabinet and had the Muslim League in perpetual discordant mode, first it did not join the government. It was always obstructing and dissenting, particularly on financial matters because it had the finance portfolio, while in the council and eventually left once the partition was announced. Nehru sent a strong message not only to the Viceroy and the British government, but also to the domestic constituency that India was on road to institution building.
Professor Mehra, sorry to interrupt you. Please start concluding. We have 5 more minutes.
Yeah, it's sufficient. I will be completing in that.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, these are very important portions. I cannot leave them. So I will be completing in 5 minutes. Viceroy Lord Ravi in his letter to King George VI on 22nd October 1946 gives condescending approval of boarding on this approval. And I quote, my new executive council or cabinet as they prefer to call themselves was sworn in the beginning of September. Of Nehru, who holds the portfolio of external affairs and Commonwealth relations, and this who tries to adopt the role of premier as far as possible, I have written before. He is cultured, highly strung, usually likable, but quite unstable and not a strong character. Our cabinet meetings have so far passed off smoothly and in a friendly atmosphere. Nehru holds daily meetings of ministers which he chooses to regard as the real cabinet meeting, and everything that comes up to the official cabinet meeting has already been discussed by the members and their line of action decided. Moreover, it also raised the stature of Nehru as de facto prime minister. Undeterred, he, along with his colleagues, continued in the cabinet mode and assigned larger areas of responsibility to the council. Obviously, this did not get well with the government. Though Secretary of State for India, Lord Patrick Lawrence, advised the Viceroy not to exercise his authority against the majority of the councils, except for the most compelling reasons. On 6 September 1946, he tried at Lord Wavell on the possibility of the interim government being overruled. He also specified the subject over which the British Parliament alone exercised authority. Nehru also asserted himself on Wavell's position on the use of Viceroy's discretionary powers over provincial governments. Wavell was of the view that the Governor General in his individual judgment or discretion and not Governor General in Council could exercise superintendence and control over provincial governments on certain matters. Nehru disagreed. What he wrote in response conveyed the message that irrespective of the prevailing legal position, he wanted to establish convention where the cabinet led by the prime minister was ultimate executive authority. And it's a very interesting portion of the letter which I have quoted, but given the paucity of time, I will not read it. Even as Nehru was particular during the interim government to treat the Governor General's Council executive as the cabinet, it willy-nilly meant that he was wearing prime ministerial mantle. While he never asserted with his colleagues in the council as the prime minister in conducting the meeting, the council prior to forming formal meetings, his assertion with the viceroy that the council was a de facto cabinet conveyed that he was seriously taking the role of the de facto prime minister of the country. Obviously, he wanted the norms to be accepted and settled in this regard. Thank you. I close here.
Thank you very much, Professor Mehra. It was indeed a pleasure to listen to this comprehensive and interesting and enlightening lecture on this subject. We are now open to questions and comments. Any questions or comments? Yeah, please raise your hand if you have a question. All right, we'll take those questions from the audience later. In the meantime, I had a couple of questions of my own. Uh, You see, Professor Mehra, as you have rightly spoken in your lecture, that whereas the Westminster model actually developed over hundreds of years, and it developed certain customs and conventions, and it is primarily, of course, based on an unwritten constitution. Now, the framers of the Indian constitution adopted and adapted, as you have said, from the Westminster model, and they tried to come as close to the conventions that had developed there over hundreds of years as possible. However, the fact remains, and as you rightly said, that over the over the next decades, the way the constitution actually played out and the relationship between prime minister, the head of the majority party, and other things played out, obviously had its own tale to tell. So I would like to know your opinion first on this the relationship between what is laid down in the constitution in terms of concrete articles and clauses and the office as it has evolved over the decades, and what do you think is the role of personalities in this, the role of historical context and the role of situations in the evolution of the constitutional practices in India as different from the text of the constitution?
Well, you see, we have already had 14 prime ministers. The 14th prime minister is already, in his second term. And personality, you see, their prime ministerial peers are not unilinear. They are impacted by several,
Can you speak a bit louder, Professor Mehra? We sometimes lose your voice.
maybe because of internet or something. What I'm saying is that we already have had 14 prime ministers. The 14th prime minister is in his second term, and the prime ministerial tenures, whether short or long, are not unilinear. These terms, go through various phases. There could be phases in which a prime minister is on a very strong turf, and there are phases where there is a strong challenge to the prime ministerial authority. If you start looking at, say, for example, Nehru's tenure, in Nehru's tenure, till 1950, in fact, between 50 and 55 also. First, till 1950, there was Sardar Patel, and beyond that, till 1955, there was Maulana Azad, and other senior leaders also who could stand up and speak to Nehru. So, whenever they thought that Nehru was trying to take a position which is not conducive to the development of the institution, they would stand up and they would tell him. So there were challenges. So, but after 1955 till 1962, Nehru had an absolute, control over the Council of Ministers and the polity, as it were. So that was the second phase of Nehru's tenure. The third part of his tenure begins from 1962 after the India's China war. And after that loss, Nehru's position was so weak that at one stage, when he was trying to defend Krishna Menon, whom everyone wanted out, he was told in clear terms that either Menon goes or you also go. So Menon had to go. Similarly, if you take another longest tenure, that of Indira Gandhi. Indira Gandhi's tenure also goes into phases. I'm leaving out Shastri because Shastri was too small tenure. But even in Shastri's tenure, towards the later part, before his death, that is, he was already facing a challenge from Mrs. Indira Gandhi. is already very well recorded. Indira Gandhi's tenure from 1966 to 67 she was absolutely diminutive personality, going by the what syndicate told her to do. From 67 to 69, she was in a fighting mode, and she was trying to build her own, group within the party and within the cabinet. From 69 to 71, she was trying to build herself up, and she emerged victorious, as it were. And after that, she had no challenges. So, what exactly I'm trying to say is that normally the tenures are not linear. It has not, interestingly, we will have to take the present tenure of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, where he did not have a challenge either in the first term or in the second term. So, because political factors appear to be totally under control as far as he is concerned. So this is how things keep changing and evolving actually.
Thank you very much, Professor Mehra. And with this, we come to an end with today's session. I thank all members of the audience for their participation and patience. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.